You're listening to Community Radio, CKMS, Radio Waterloo, 102.7, 946 on the Rogers Digital Network. You can find us.
Happy Monday, Waterloo Region. It's Monday, August the 12th, and today we have a show filled with poetry from the Arlington Six. But first, we're going to listen to Tourist Company. This is Fractured State.
We saw the wrong signs in our minds. We slowly worked ourselves to death. It's just the wrong time in a long line of things we saw from far away. I don't wanna fight like this, but I wanna feel it all. We can't tell it's taking its toll. I don't want to live it way out. If it's gonna break my heart, we can't tell it's taking its toll. We can't live our lives like this. We can't tell it's taking its toll. We can't live our lives like this. We can't tell it's taking its toll. We felt the warning signs below shake the ground beneath our feet. It's easy just to pin this all on stress, but it's a mess we made ourselves. I don't wanna fight like this, but I wanna feel it all. We can't tell it's taking its toll. I don't wanna quit it way out. If it's gonna break my heart, we can't tell it's taking its toll. I don't wanna fight like this, but I wanna feel it all. We can't tell it's taking its toll. I don't wanna live way out. If it's gonna break my heart, we can't tell it's taking its toll. We can't live our lives like this. We can't tell it's taking its toll.
I am Canadian, I am Canuck. This is where I want to be, in a country that is strong and free. Are you Canadian? Are you Canuck? Tell me if you like to boast of a country built from coast to coast. Roll up the rim, it's on a cup. Timmy's is a place to play. I'm going there almost every day. Are you an atheist, or do you believe the Lord our God, we are the most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost? I am Canadian, I am Canuck. This is where I want to be, in a country that is strong and free. Are you Canadian? Are you Canuck? Tell me if you like to boast of a country built from coast to coast. Hockey night in Canada, it's on TV. The Habs score 7, Toronto 2. Don Cherry's our coach for you. Are you American, living in the States? We have friendly neighbors and love to say hi to our friends in the USA. I am Canadian, I am Canuck. This is where I want to be, in a country that is strong and free. Are you Canadian? Are you Canuck? Tell me if you like to boast of a country built from coast to coast. We love our beaver tails, you'll love them too. Chocolate syrup or any spread, they're not the kind you take to bed. Are you a veteran, or senior too. Our leaders are tired and going to bed. We're sorry for everything else they've said. I am Canadian, I am Canuck. This is where I want to be, in a country that is strong and free. Are you Canadian? Are you Canuck? Tell me if you like to boast of a country built from coast to coast. We love our 2-4s, going topless too. One of them is a national sport, the other is legal that floats your boat. Are you a Newfie? Or say bonjour, hi. We make fun of ourselves, some say hate us, those very same things that make us great. I am Canadian, I am Canuck. This is where I want to be, in a country that is strong and free. Are you Canadian? Are you Canuck? Tell me if you like to boast of a country built from coast to coast. I am Canadian, I am Canuck. This is where I want to be, in a country that is strong and free. Are you Canadian? Are you Canuck? Tell me if you like to boast of a country built from coast to coast.
That's Doug Smith, and he is Canadian. That's from his I Am Canadian album. Doug Smith wrote to us. He said, I'm a Canadian singer, songwriter, entertainer, and recording artist. Also a former 20-year Gulf War veteran of the Canadian Forces. I've been playing guitar and singing for only 6 years, and my music is currently streaming in 37 countries around the world in only 5 months. I'm heading back to the studio to record 2 more albums this year, which includes a Christmas album. Doug writes he was born in Airtree Castle, Stirling, Scotland in 1959. His parents and siblings immigrated to Canada in June of 1965. Doug became a Canadian citizen and joined the Canadian Forces in 1976, where he served 20 years in Canada and Europe. Doug's a veteran of the First Gulf War and is honorably released from the Canadian Forces in January of 1996. He picked up his first guitar in October of 2012 for $100 at the local pawn shop at the age of 53. He's a self-taught singer, songwriter, musician, and now a recording artist. Thank you, Doug, for sending us the music. We'll be hearing more from Doug in a bit. Before that, we heard a tourist company. Writes, Tyler Swindles from the band said that Fractured State was partially inspired by the riots of Charlottesville. He remembers watching the news footage and feeling lost at the state of humanity. In the moment, the world felt broken. There were so many lines of tension running through the plot, points of current events, and the president seemed to be predictably spiraling out of control. Essentially, the song that we heard, Fractured State, is about that emotional tension and the pressures of living in a world that feels like it's falling apart. Hopefully we can stitch it back together again. Today on the show, we have the Arlington Six. Apparently that's a new moniker for a group of poets coming out of Cambridge. Welcome you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Elizabeth McCallister. I'm a poet who lives in Brantford.
Mark Kempf, I live in Brantford, soon to be Paris.
I'm Lin Geary. I live in Paris, and I'm really happy I'm part of the Arlington Six, because that's where the Arlington is.
Jim Tompkins, I live in Brantford, and I too am happy to be a member of the newly named Arlington Six.
It's named after the place where you usually gather.
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Hotels.
A bar called The Edit, which seems appropriate.
Yeah.
Is that a good venue for creating poetry, creating art?
We don't exactly create it there. We positively criticize one another's work and make suggestions and make jokes about this, that, and the other thing. And generally, it's a sort of co-editing kind of operation.
You've been at it long?
We started out as a workshop in Brantford, and it's just that there are a lot of Brantford poets, and there are several Brantford groups, and we finally migrated to where there was beer.
It's that's the reason for getting together, then, is it? And the poetry is just an excuse.
It's a grand pleasure to yammer about poetry with a drink in your hand, let me tell you.
How long have you been at it?
As a poet or the group?
Let's start with the group. How long has the group been around?
Lynn started it So year and a half, maybe.
18 months, I'd say, probably
Yeah.
in that area.
There's a
And
brief
we
break.
meet monthly,
Yeah.
so.
Okay. But you've been writing poetry longer than that.
Long time, and we're all part of the Brantford group as well. That's been going for years and years. So
I started in the late 80s, so I guess it's been a while that I've been trying to write poetry.
And we belong to, I know Mark has belonged to the Hamilton, there's a Hamilton poetry group. And there's also, Elizabeth's belonged to the Cambridge poetry group. So,
And I belong to Tower Poetry Society in Hamilton, which is the longest standing poetry group in Canada. It was formed in 1951, and it's called Tower because of the tower at McMaster University.
That's interesting. There's a lot more poetry around than I knew about. Poetry doesn't seem to have a high profile in today's culture.
no, it does not. Actually,
Well,
so
it depends, because poetry is also about songs and rhythm and meter. And so I think there's still a bit of poetry in the songs that we listen to. And I wouldn't say it's down and out, but it's certainly the more conventional style of poetry isn't around that much.
there's a stat that's going around. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but the stat is that there's only 1/4 of the poems being read now that there would have been 2 generations ago, but there's 4 times the number of people writing poetry. So we tend to be writing it for ourselves, largely online and things. Not us as a group, but poetry in general, I think. So it's not broadly accepted. It's, it's trotted out when there's something important going on. If there's a tragedy, there's a poem read. And there's always one, whenever president or prime minister comes in. But other than that, they're not really part of current culture, let's say, in North America.
Right. Except that it's been set to music and we
Right.
hear it as songs on the radio.
Yeah. Although even then, right, lyric is a type of poetry, but quite often people that are musicians and songwriters also publish poetry books, stuff that isn't lyric. So it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah, that's where it started, but it's not where it finishes.
Yeah, essentially we've come a long way from Leonard Cohen, who was a poet and then turned into somebody who purported to sing, but he sang his own songs and so on. So that's the mixture of poetry and music.
There's a lot of Leonard Cohen songs that he doesn't really sing. He's reciting to music.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As he said, only in Canada would he be named the best singer of the year.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, and we forgot that children do a lot of poetry in elementary school.
Right.
And they may learn to write it, they may not. They maybe write some haikus to learn about syllables. They may learn to write 4-line poems to learn about rhyme. But for them, it disappears a little bit. It gets into, oh, well, that's British poetry, that's Canadian poetry. And we label it, but we don't write it anymore by the time you get past high school. So, some of us do, but
yeah. So what keeps you going after high school?
well, for me, actually learning that haiku wasn't 3 lines with 17 syllables, that it was something that could be much more else with intent. I joined Haiku Canada, and I learned to write a lot of different kinds of Japanese verse, and I'm excited by it because it's basically a way of learning to write with very few words, very concrete, but there's a motor in it. And it's almost like it's the most bland stuff on the surface, but once you get the code, you can see that there's something else going on. And sometimes you get that aha, as Japanese poets like to find. So for me, that's what I was.
It's the aha you're getting as you're creating something new, and suddenly it has legs it didn't have before.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So.
Okay. What about you, Jim?
Well, I was listening fairly recently to Stephen Fry, a long rant about language, that we should not be grammar Nazis, but essentially language is the only thing that we have to communicate with one another, and we must treasure it and we must use it. And one of the finest uses of language, as far as I'm concerned, is in poetry. And the late Toni Morrison last week, I remember a quotation from her that dovetails with this, that essentially we're born and we die, and the only thing in between those two things is language. And so that's why I write poetry.
Legacy, something to leave after your corporeal body is no longer with us.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Mark?
I think it was just two things. I love language, so I think I started kind of figuring out how to play with language more. And I'm also have this artistic muscle, but I have no artistic talent. So language was the one way I could express it.
Certainly poetry is art.
Poetry is
it?
definitely art, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I'm just saying in general, that's how I ended up there. Poetry is definitely art. And I think one of the big challenges really is to have poetry seen as an equal art form to anything else, right? Yeah. From music to painting to sculpture. So I believe that poetry is at least the equivalent of those art forms, but that's not generally seen. And poetry also takes some work, right, for someone to digest it, as opposed to just seeing something visual that you see for 30 seconds and have a judgment on or have a sense of.
Wandering through an art gallery, most people make the tour of a gallery in a couple of hours. That must encompass 1,000 or so pieces of art.
Yeah,
that's seconds per piece of art. But if you're reading a piece of poetry, it takes longer.
It does, yeah, and you can really only digest, I don't know, a handful really at one sitting, right, and get anything out of them. Yeah. So it's definitely a challenge. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I love writing poetry. I love every little stitch of it, right? From the idea to generating it to thinking about it for a month to editing to the whole thing. I love it. Yeah.
Thinking about it for a month. I want to come back to that because short poems should take little time to write.
Well, we'd be over to Lin here with the haiku. They are very short, but they take an inordinate amount of time, I believe.
It can easily take a year before you would consider it ready to publish, and then you're going to maybe publish it in a magazine that has 100 readers. So it's a work of love.
It must be. Yeah. Elizabeth, what got you into writing and what keeps you going now?
Well, I've always written poetry, starting as a child, and I got into my father's high school English literature courses and started reading the greats. And I never looked back from there. The problem was finding my own voice, and I didn't discover that until I moved out to Saskatchewan, out to Saskatoon, where they have a wonderful writers community. And I was supported by some very, very good writers who helped me develop my little fragments into proper poems. And that was really gratifying to know that, yes, I did have a talent for it, that it wasn't just something I like to do in secret and pretend like it meant something. It was actually something.
A lot of secret poets?
I think there's quite a few secret poets because there's also this thing in society that people write to release some psychic energy, which doesn't always translate well into poetry. Not everybody is going to be Sylvia Plath, for example. So there are a lot of secret poets, and some of them are good and some of them are not. As with anything, there can be a lot of secret artists who like painting watercolors in their home, and it's good enough for family, but would you say that they're good enough to go out into the world? That's a whole other story.
Right. So you said that the poetry being consumed is at 1/4 of what it used to be a few hundred years ago. Yet there's 4 times as many poets out there. So what venues are available for publication? And is it just that those aren't being read anymore?
Well, poetry books themselves don't sell. So it's mainline publishers do exist that publish the odd poetry book, but the big ones only publish very few. Then there's a number of really good poetry publishers that will only do 4 or 5 books a year. And then most publishing is online, and there's all kinds of e-zines and magazines, and there's just all kinds of stuff that is published online through kind of functional services. So it wouldn't be someone just like yourself, Bob, somebody who's taken a hobby of something they like to do and then expanded it to be a bigger thing. And they make it their life work to publish 2 volumes a year of something. And they might read 500 poems to come up with 30 that they want to publish,
Right.
even though it's online. So we have all applied to and have been published widely online.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of us in print as well, but it's few and far between. And there's a secondary, I don't know if you call it a C class kind of publishing that goes on, but it is official publishing. There's editors, there's publishers and things, but it's really modest. You know, there's no promotion, there's no anything else.
Yeah.
It's people just like to get books published under their title, under their publishing title, and they need poets to be published.
Yeah.
And so we're the kind of poets that do that, I guess.
I think there'd be more demand for published printed poetry, be it print-on-demand technology. You can have your collection of poetry assembled, within a couple of days of requesting a
Right.
copy of the book.
Well, you're right. So as soon as you can get it published, then it's published on demand. So if my modest book, for instance, it's on Amazon. So if I'm on Amazon, there's lots on Amazon, and if somebody can order it today and get it tomorrow, and somehow, right, it's a miracle. And that's just how a lot of the publishing's done.
I think too, it's also the move in society to being over the internet. Jim and I were at Ontario Poetry Society workshop where John B. Lee, who's the poet laureate of Brantford in Norfolk County, was discussing that sometimes, and this is very important for language, is that nuances can be lost when it's just blank on the screen, that there's something about the pixelated screen that doesn't necessarily translate everything appropriately. But there's this move right now that everybody wants to be online, and everybody wants to be out there online on Instagram, on Facebook, or whatever. And so that's why poetry is sort of gravitating towards that. I'm not sure it's unhealthy or healthy. I haven't made up my mind about that yet.
So Mark's published stuff in
Yeah.
print on Amazon.
Yeah.
Where do you have your stuff?
My stuff, I was published by Cambridge Publishing House,
Ah.
a small one, Craigley Press. Notes from Suburbia, that came out in 2014, but I think it is, except for me, I have some copies for sale. Sure. I have some copies for sale. So, but you'd have to find me in order to do that. And one of my latest things was, and this is a very good thing, it's available on, is this the way we do this?
Yeah,
Okay.
That's the way you do it.
Tamarac's Canadian Poetry for the 21st Century. That was published by a California publisher. It is available on Amazon. It's a number of Canadian poets, a number of different styles from coast to coast. And I happen to be lucky enough to be one of the poets included in that.
Yeah, that's great.
So, yeah.
How about you, Lynn?
I don't have a book of my own. My children say, Mom, you should. And I suppose that'll happen someday if I make it that long. But what I've really enjoyed doing is I've enjoyed belonging to a group of people that are going to maybe put a book together. I have something here that I can also put up. This is called Gusts, and it's a group of poets that are interested in writing Japanese verse again, but this is tanka, which is a 5-line verse. It's a little more relaxed than a haiku, which is only 3 lines, and it's a little more emotional. And so what happens is that people belong to the group. You subscribe, and two times a year, out comes a magazine with your poems. Now you send your poems in. It's an edited magazine, so you also might not get yourself in print, even though you belong to the group. Yeah. Same with Haiku Canada. They do have a members anthology. Comes out once a year, and you send them 5 poems. They'll pick one, and it goes in. So you're guaranteed 1 3-line poem. Now, for me, I've published otherwise in lots of other venues, but they're usually somebody else's magazine, right. And I'm just sending something.
No collected works of Lin Geary are out there yet.
Not yet. Well, I did Well, I did a little tiny run of 50
Ah,
poems, and it was I think it's called Harvest Moon. It was about 5 inches by 5 inches, and my son got me. He largely put it together for me, and we had a color printer, and we ran it off, and I was sold out in a day. So I was
Wow.
I was thrilled.
yes.
All my friends bought one.
Yeah.
So-called friends.
I was going to say, Lynn's being very modest. She's so
Yes.
good at haiku and tanka that she's won awards for it. And in Vancouver, the Cherry Blossom Festival is a particularly sophisticated and well-renowned event, and she won, which means she gets her haiku on a bus. It gets published actually in the, locally very broadly, and it's one of the major awards for haiku in the world, so it becomes known around the world.
Having your poetry on a bus is way bigger than having it in a little 5x5 book.
Oh, it's amazing. In fact, I brought you a copy of it's in my bag over there, but it's, it's usually advertising on the Vancouver buses. So the Vancouver, the Cherry Blossom Festival puts that up on the buses for 2 months.
Yeah.
I've seen the occasional 1 or 2 line poem on the buses here in GRT and in Toronto as well.
Yeah.
So it's
Might be catching on. Yeah.
It was a phase in the 90s where a lot of municipalities were putting poetry on the buses for people. But yeah, you've also had one of your haikus set to music. And she's multi-talented, this writer, because she's also written one-woman plays. And so she's also directed things as well. So she's written one-woman plays.
Well, one woman, one play.
Okay, fair enough. I
that
stand
was not
corrected.
confined to poetry alone. Excellent. And Jim, what have you got?
Well,
You got another
got
one.
as far.
Is that it?
Yeah.
I've got as far as self-publishing a couple of books. This is the latest one called Scribbles. The beautiful design you see on there is from my very talented wife, Barbara, and she has some poems in there also. I'm published in the annual anthologies of the Ontario Poetry Society. Dancing on Stones is this year's, but as yet I haven't submitted a collection of my works to a publisher to give it a crack. I might try and self-publish again. I've sold a few of those, but as you said earlier, so much of this is simply about legacy,
Right.
and leaving something behind.
Right.
So, yeah.
Here's a concrete thing somebody can hold to say this is Jim.
Well, exactly. And I'm along with John B. Lee yesterday talking about the fact that online there is no nuance. So much is lost. It's the same as reading a book as opposed to looking at a screen.
Right. So you've all got these books. It must cost to publish those, even though they're, I imagine, print on demand. Are you breaking even?
Well, my book was published by a publisher in New Jersey, so it didn't cost me anything, except, of course, I'm the one that buys the most copies to sell to other people at a loss, right? So does it cost me any money? A little bit, yeah. But it's not, the publishing wasn't at my cost anyway.
Okay.
So.
And mine essentially was really high finance. I think it cost $4.74 to have a Scribbles made. I've been selling at the exorbitant price of $10. And I think as of 2 months ago, I broke even.
Ha! Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, that's right. That's a big moment.
It surprised me.
Mine was published by a publisher, so I didn't lose money except for the copies that I have left to sell, that I bought to sell to people. But I didn't make any money on it. I don't think.
So when you're published by a publishing company, there are royalties, allegedly?
Allegedly, I think a lot of people think a lot of writers are very well off in terms of their royalties. I think a poet is worse off than a historian. My husband's a historian, and they all joke that for the annual royalty for some of their books, you can take your family out to McDonald's.
Yeah.
And so all of this publishing
Mhm.
that happens, a lot of it is done for love.
Yes.
It has to be love, even if it's history or poetry or other things. Most people know they're not going to make it rich.
And the commercial publishers, what motivates them to publish works that have 1/4 of the market spread that they used to have?
I think it's more, as Mark said, we're going to be published by the small independents. We're not going to be published by Random House. It's just the bigger ones, they want the big name people. And those big name people usually come from the creative writing academia. So that people who come out of university with a name and with a backing. It's not to say they don't deserve it. They do. They did the hard work and all the rest of it, but they're the ones who generally get noticed right away.
Right. And so they're the ones that get picked up by the publishers.
Yeah.
And that's where the publishers
Yeah.
make a profit,
Yeah.
possibly at the expense of the lesser known poets.
Well, don't forget too that various governments have cut a lot of the grants to the arts, that a lot of the arts, there are journals who have gone out of business, literary journals, where you used to publish in a few literary journals, build up your reputation. But a lot of those places now, they're struggling to make ends meet. And some of them have gone under. Same thing with small publishers. There's just not the grants out there across the country, not just Ontario, to fund art. People see it as this frou-frou thing that doesn't deserve any funding.
Right. I've heard the opposite. I've heard people say that, people who might benefit from government social programs, perhaps, but they say, don't cut the funding. This is what gives us the pleasure in life. This is what gives us meaning in our life. So yes, we need the disability pensions. We need the Ontario Works program, but we also need the arts funding, because that's what makes life worth living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Really, what's left 100 years from now is art, right?
That's right.
So whether it's architecture or paintings or poetry.
Statues of politicians.
Yes. Yeah. That's what comes down, right?
Yeah. But you're right. You're right. People aren't remembered for, the ditches they dug or the roads they paved. They're remembered for the art that's left behind.
Yeah. And defines the culture of the times.
Yeah. I'd like to switch to another song, more Doug Smith, from another Canadian poet, Wade Hemsworth. Wade Hemsworth wrote Log Driver's Waltz, wrote things about Canadian, wrote the Black Fly song. So this is Doug Smith and his interpretation of the Log Driver's Waltz.
If you ask any girl from the valley around what pleases her most, from her head to her toes, she'll say, I'm not sure that it's business of yours, but she does like to waltz with her log driver, for he goes burling down and down Whitewater. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burling down and down Whitewater. A log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. When the drive's nearly over, she likes to go down and watch all the lads as they work on the river. She knows that come evening they'll be in the town, and they all like to waltz with the log driver, for he goes burling down and down Whitewater. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burling down and down Whitewater. A log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. To please both her parents, she had to give way and dance with the doctors and merchants and lawyers. Their manners are fine, but their feet are of clay, for there's none with the style of her log driver, for he goes burling down and down Whitewater. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burling down and down Whitewater. A log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. Now she's had many chances with all sorts of men, but none is so fine as her lad on the river. So when the drive's over, if he asks her again, she thinks she will marry her log driver. For he goes burling down and down white water. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burling down and down white water. A log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. Burling down and down white water. A log driver's waltz pleases girls completely.
It's time to repair the mess you did there. Right over there, yeah, you know where. The treatment unfair to the ones who live there. You charge them a fare, put them on welfare, but why would you care? Stand there and stare, the signaling flare, shot in the air. Are people unaware of the papers prepared? The government you paired, agreements you dared. Back the heck up, of you we ain't scared. So hang up your coat, hang up your skates, hide your damn face and stay out of the way. Elect a real chief, not this frickin' fake. Public debate, food on your plates, potato and steak, Lewski debate. It's better than cake. Community strong, let us create. Holy cripe sakes, our future's at stake. Damn. X up the box, X marks the spot. Election season, baby, sign on the dot. X up the plot, X has got bought. Hey, I will not, your lesson be taught. X marks the spot, expect a shot. Aim that red dot, your turn to a stop. Mullah, our home, it's always been known as a free land for our children to roam. We watch them grow up until they're full grown, but we're on a track with a tire that's blown. Stop, pull over, get out and fix it. Get rid of the busted tire, it's twisted. Pick up the phone, call for some help. I know kids who make more sense at 12. Books on the shelf, teach them to read. Not the kids, chief and counsel indeed. The future is bright. The future has light. The future is clear. Just get through the night. The future brings fear to those who just might hold your future down, control you with might. In the near future, you'll just have to fight. Protect your kids, go protect your rights. X up the box, X marks the spot. Election season, baby, sign on the dot. X up the plot, X has got bought. Hey, I will not, your lesson be taught. X marks the spot. Expect a shot, aim that red dot, your turn to a stop. Start the campaign, point fingers and blame. Make a big poster, 5 minutes of fame. A slogan so lame, it hurts your own brain. Oh sweet God, the visual pain. Don't you complain, it's always the same. A whole bunch of promises that they will claim. They'll cut your grass, braid you sweet grass. Wanna get high, they'll give you some grass. This year's election, there's no rent collection. Everyone's hired, no staff selection. Mail in the ballots for their inspection. Once I get in, I'll change my whole life. Hire my sister and hire my wife. X up the box, X marks the spot. Election season, baby, sign on the dot. X up the plot, X has got bought. Hey, I will not, your lesson be taught. X marks the spot, expect a shot. Aim that red dot, your turn to a stop.
X marks the spot by Q052. Q052 is a strong advocate for Indigenous youth and women fighting alongside his brothers and sisters. He started to write in hope that his truthful music will inspire systemic change. Q stands for Quentin. 052 is the official governmental name for his reserve. Welcome to Geskapiag in Gaspesia. Nominated this year at the prestigious Indigenous Music Awards as Best New Artist, and after appearing for the first time with the EP Lateral Virence, Micmac rapper Q052 launched his first album, Res Life. With as much phlegm and intensity as the first titles, the album takes aim at the difficult issues Indigenous peoples are facing across Turtle Island. An old-school hip-hop punch in the face, which should recognize many Indigenous sisters and brothers. Was it poetry?
I'd say absolutely. It was carefully written and clever, which the poetry always isn't clever, but it certainly was that. It drove a metaphor and expanded on it. It's definitely poetry.
I'm gonna agree that it's poetry. I think that the function has shifted slightly. At one time, I mean, we could go back and we say, yeah, like the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, it was historical. You know, we're going to remember our past. This is much more in the present tense, and it has a purpose. But it's the Iliad and the Odyssey had a purpose.
True.
So, you know, it's got that rhyme, it's got the drive, the energy.
Yeah.
I love it.
I found this more listenable than a lot of the hip hop that comes across the turntables here at the radio station, and so it struck me as being something I'd like to listen to on the show and get your opinions. Yeah, it's radio. Nodding doesn't work.
I know. But I was letting you finish your thought. I think it is. I mean, I go back to that poetry started, as Lin was alluding to, and even some of the earliest English literature poems were basically news feeds to the people, and they were set to songs so people could remember them, and they would have the hooks so people could remember them. And now they're considered great works of art because they've stood the test of time. And this one, it's more intelligible, yes, because the beat was slower, but he still had all the hooks. He had, rhyme where rhyme was appropriate. The beat was good. A lot of times when people rhyme, it doesn't necessarily work with the rhythm. Right. But no, it's great poetry, and it's poetry with a purpose.
Yes.
And it's not a rant, because sometimes rants don't work very well as poems, that if he was just, although they have a right to, Aboriginals do have a right to do that.
Does it have staying power? Do you think that this will last the centuries as other poems in the past have done?
I'm going to guess not. The one thing with spoken word poetry as well, slam poetry, is that even though it can be carefully crafted and can be exceptionally good poetry, on the page it doesn't look so good. It doesn't read quite as profoundly or as completely as a poem.
So if I got the lyric sheet and were to read it for myself, I wouldn't get that rhythm. I wouldn't get his emotional inflection.
Right. So it may not last because it may not stand up on the page long term. And wouldn't it be nice if it didn't stand up because it was old history and that we didn't need it anymore? Oh. Wouldn't that be nice? I don't see that happening, but that'd be great.
That'd be true. So we've been chatting about poetry, about publishing, about what qualifies for poetry and what doesn't for close to 45 minutes now. And we haven't heard a single poem from you folks yet.
We noticed.
And we have decided that I was going to open it up. Very good. A secret conversation that we had here. And one of our most talented members can't be here right now, Stan J. White. And he has this wonderful quote that we've all loved about him. Paintings are like poems. They are thoughts abandoned. Just if you think about that whole thought, how artwork is about that, it's a thought abandoned, but it invites the viewer or the reader into that abandoned thought to finish it, that it becomes, a joint sort of thing that you're doing together. And he brought these at one of our meetings recently, and Mark wants to hear a music hall. So now Stan is also from England, and so some of his poetry, when he reads it for himself, has this wonderful inflection of his accent, but I don't have that. So music hall. Sex is something God has thrown in to ensure we do not confuse ourselves with deities, with angels, a kind of tether that never lets us stray too far from freshly turned earth after rain, and in the pathos of it all, a constant reminder of vaudeville, of burlesque. We wanted to have Stan part of this. Yes. The other 6, I don't think we have any of Kathy's poems. No, we don't have any of Kathy's poems. So,
but she's busy in New York, probably gathering material. She writes a lot of poems that are about places that she has traveled to, and she's a world traveler. So we love
Good.
what she brings to us.
Yeah.
If I might go next, this one I'm going to try and tie into the new name of the Arlington Six, and the fact that Mark said earlier that poetry goes better with beer, and it's also true that you write about things that you know about. So this is one of my poems from quite a few years ago. It's called An Ode to Beer. O amber elixir crowned with golden head, whence came your magic mystical mixture of barley, mash, crystalline water, fruity hops, brewed hodgepodge in containers from Sumeria to China, through cellared wooden kegs to Pilsen caves, and glistening copper kettles row on row, drunk in liters, pints, Aussie schooners, halves, viertels, even once a 6-ounce 10-cent draft. Oh, wine, where is thy claim? Full muted by this tasty, honest brew, from ancient cloudy ale to new craft sips, past charcoal stout, beach blonde lager, hoppy pale, sweet chocolate mild. Old sips tease lips, tempt discerning tongues, foaming mustaches form in the tingling wake of fermented flavors gliding down. Quaffed, not guzzled, savored, not chugged, each nuanced batch unique. Taste, robust or delicate, stirs heightened eloquence, smoother patter, bravado's hope. Enter the intoxicating dreamland of ambrosial brew. Beer, cerveza, live on, O amber elixir, crowned with gold.
I detect a lot of fun in that.
Well, I hope so.
I think it's a love song.
Yes, very much so, I think.
I think that's what a lot of people mistake, that they learn all this serious poetry in high school and junior school and elementary school. But poetry can be a lot of fun. It can be a lot of fun. It can be very, very serious. It can be political, but it can also be a lot of fun. Stan has written some really funny stuff. Jim just read you a funny one. It doesn't have to be all, oh, the world is falling apart and you must pay attention to this.
Yeah. I got the impression of humor, of fun, of appreciation, of love, just from the tone of your voice. Is poetry meant to be read, or is it meant to be listened to?
I'd have to say that I think because I've been told in certain groups that I am the voice, apparently I have a voice that lends itself well to reading poetry. I think it should be heard rather than read.
And radio is ideally suited to that. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To yourself, though, by the way. So when I'm reading poetry, if I come across a poem I like, I'll read it out loud to myself, and it's so much better. It's for one thing, the emotional is broader if you're reading it. So a poem that strikes you as being quite sentimental or emotional, it just becomes more so when you read it.
I suppose if you're reading it out loud, you have to pace yourself. If you're reading, you could speed read and just scan across the page and miss nuances, miss whole words perhaps.
Right.
And if you're reading deliberately, thoughtfully, then it gives you time to pause and think as you're hearing the poem.
That's a great point, because you can't read poems like you read a novel, right? Where you're you're gathering words in your vision and sliding by them. Poems are carefully constructed. Each word makes sense, or each line carries some weight. And so, you have to be very careful with it.
Right.
So I think we're back to the whole idea that if it's read, you get all the inflections, all the nuance that you don't get simply reading it.
Right.
It's read out loud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I agree. And I think we come to the Arlington to read our poem, to be critiqued, but also just to entertain. We'd like a little response, and sometimes that's why we work even harder at our poem because somebody is going to listen to it.
Yeah. Do you go to entertain or do you go to be entertained?
Oh, it's all of it. I mean, if Stan's there,
It's both. It's both.
and if Jim's there, and Mark,
Uh-huh.
and Elizabeth, and Kathy, it's all of that. All of that.
Really? Have you got something for us, Mark?
I'm not sure how many poems we'll get to read, so I'm going to read one of my favorite poems that I didn't write.
All right.
So if it's okay. It's by Wendell Berry, who just passed away last month.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Flosser, poet, writer, farmer in
yes,
Kentucky.
Yes.
Spectacular guy. Yeah. And his.
We know him through the working center here. He's very influential in the working center here. It's an employment center officially on paper, but it does so much community work, and it's based largely on the philosophies of Wendell Berry.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So this poem just always touches me. And we've just bought a place I haven't moved to it yet that's on a river. And this poem, my wife read it last night, and she's not a big poetry person, but she loves this poem. The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
That was relaxing. Yeah.
Spectacular poem, eh?
It is.
Yeah.
No, sorry, we're all sitting here in a reverie. Here,
But that shows how good a poem it was that somebody taught me a number of years ago back in Saskatchewan. Is if everybody's being really quiet after you finish your poem, that's a good thing. That's like a really good thing because you've hit people where they live. You've done something to transform their lives, even just for a moment.
Yes. Yes.
Do you mind if I read one more? Just
No,
because
please do.
Just because sort of it's not in the same theme exactly, but same tone maybe.
Okay.
And
Wendell Berry again?
pardon?
Wendell Berry again?
No, this will be Mark Kempf.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Oh, this is good.
Not necessarily a step down.
These are the touching sad poems that Elizabeth warned you against.
I did not warn you against. I just said that they don't always turn out.
Yes. This one's called Salvage Operations. It is the end of something. The pear trees in the side yard are dripping their soft fruit. A dull foop as they land. Bees by the bagful harvest the sweetness, hovering, the ground alive with them. The new doctor says, "Don't you give up on you. I'm not." The tomatoes have already rotted off, red and black oblongs in the dirt. Peppers are gone too, each Hungarian's point gnawed by rabbits, the yellow hollows scavenged now. Late apples will be next, the russets for ignoring the spies meant for pies. Only whatever lies underground is salvageable. Potatoes and horseradish, a few beets, the garlic against the house I forgot about, the scapes gone dry as shed twine.
End of summer, beginning of winter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. More silence and appreciation of the poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've heard it before.
Yeah.
That's true.
I was gonna say just about poetry in general. There's a lot of theories about poetry or what makes poetry, but in one of the favorites I have is that a poem will communicate or deliver or just illustrate, let's say, something that can't be done better in any other form. So I think in Wendell Berry's particularly, like you could write a short story that wouldn't be anywhere near as good as that, as communicating it, right?
Because in poetry, there's much more emphasis on the selection of individual words, I imagine, to have it fit into the form of whatever poem the author is creating.
Yeah. And how each line and each word jammed against each other and how they spin off each other. quite often the rhythm of the words together,
Yes.
or so there's all kinds of little magic explosions going on in poems that you can't really see, but it only works because they're there.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I'll step away from the mic now.
Okay, Lynn, you haven't had a turn yet, so
Okay. Well, I'll follow with a sort of something from the fall, but this is a little more, not just a ballad, maybe crossed over with an anthem. I'm thinking about November the 11th, and it's something that I started because I saw my neighbor at the cenotaph. So this is called At the Cenotaph. At the cenotaph, on a skinny, cold day, bespoke in black long lamb coat and boot-lined comfort, there alongside my fellow Canadians, it's time to jet out my chin in once-a-year pride, stand curbside guard, to miscount the endless placings of the many wreaths, to breathe out thoughtless mind frost into thin, thin air. And the mic kicks in and out, and a faultless child sings the Queen's old anthem. And we all raise our descant and filler voices, not missing a beat. And Henry calls the color guard to attention. Present flags. It is only then the tears begin, cloud my eyes and bite my cheeks, because Henry has led the Legion Parade, because Henry is my long widowed neighbor, because Henry is 92, bent and strong. And I think, happy birthday, Canada, because it is the 11th of November, 99 years of armistice after a war that birthed our nation. And we stand still firm, still cold, in perpetual grief, still hoping for peace. That's my neighbor who's now moved someplace else. But
yes.
It became one of those things that for me, just for me, had to be said. And I still have to give it to him. So
Yeah.
he hasn't heard it.
That's lovely. That evoked images. You know, I've stood at the cenotaph and I could identify. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
That's a great poem. That's a fantastic poem.
Shall I read you something? Let me just change the tone
Okay.
so we can. It's a poem. It's very short. It's a haiku, but it's the haiku that absolutely made me join Haiku Canada and start writing haiku, because a very famous, not to anybody else, but a very famous haiku poet took out a whistle and blew his whistle afterwards and waved it around. So I knew that I had hit a chord. Anyway, so because of that, hurrah, I thought I could maybe do it. Anyway, I was in Vancouver. It was at the gathering of the haiku poets. Once a year, they gather for their annual general meeting, and a lot of mayhem, maybe a bit of drinking. And so anyway, we had to sit in a circle and recite our favorite haiku. I didn't have one because I had never written one. So one came to me on the spot. If you know where the University of British Columbia is, it's at Point Grey roughly, but it sits above Wreck Beach, and Wreck Beach is a clothing optional beach. And it was in May, so it really, only the herons were going clothing optional. But anyway, I had been down and I came back, and here was my little poem. My new raincoat for Wreck Beach, clear plastic. So there's the aha.
Yes.
The aha moment.
It definitely needs that introduction to give it the context.
Nobody in Vancouver needs the intro, but yes, here we do.
It's been wonderful. That's a whole hour used up, and we've barely delved into the material you've brought with you.
The snacks.
So let's take a quick break. This is CKMS Community Connections. My name is Bob Jonkman. I'm here with the Arlington Six, or at least 4 out of the Arlington Six. Elizabeth, Mark, Lynn, and Jim. We'll be back in a few minutes with more poetry and CKMS Community Connections. CKMS FM 102, broadcasting from Waterloo Region.
Hey, it's Steve Todd from Tavistock. You're listening to Community Radio, CKMS, Radio Waterloo at 102.7 FM.
Baby, know that I can't stay, but I don't really want to go. Every little thing I need is out there on the road. Leave a little piece of me, something tiny you can hold. But baby, don't forget my face when I walk up to your door. I was working on the side, I would hang my head down low. I was walking through life blind, and he showed me where to go. Take 2 steps to the right, not too fast, not too slow. Let's stay together for the night, and another 5 years or so. I just want you to see you're the right girl for me, don't you know? You slow, girl, you're setting me on fire. You make my embers glow. You leave a little piece of you, something to warm my bones. 'Cause I don't know what I would do if I found myself alone. I just want you to see you're the right girl for me, don't you know? Want you to see you're the right girl for me, don't you know? La-da-da-da-da-da, 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 la-da-da-da-da-da.
There's so much pain, too many games you played, so many ups and downs. In this world I've seen my share of heartache. When I look around, tears of broken promises, fears and no more honesty. I've had enough of this. So sorry that I had to walk away. Oh, I'm sorry, so sorry that I left you on this day. I'm fed up, no more, sick of this metaphor. Tired of lies, tired of life, but there's nothing I like. It's going my way. I'm finished, it's over, and all I can say is now. Sorry. years go by while you fade away. The sun is shining bright, but the dark inside is cold and strong and putting up a fight. Tears of broken promises, fears and no more honesty. I've had enough of this. So sorry that I had to walk away. Oh, I'm sorry, so sorry that I left you on this day. I'm fed up, no more, sick of this metaphor. Tired of life when nothing I like is going my way. I'm bitter it's over and all I can say is stop, I'm drowning, stop, I'm falling. No more wasted days I'm walking out. Days I'm walking out.
That was Sabrina Falla and singing Sorry from her album called Sabrina Falla. And before that, we had Union Duke and La-Di-Da-Di-Da. Lyrical poetry, if I ever heard it. Listening to CKMS Community Connections. My name is Bob Jonk, and I'm here with the Arlington Six, 4 of the Arlington Six from the area of Paris, Ontario.
Yep.
And we were just talking about what happens at a poetry meeting. And it's not just everybody who can get together in a group of poets. What were you telling us there, Elizabeth, in the break there?
You have to have enough trust in the people that when you're presenting it, it's not necessarily that we're writing confessional stuff that's deeply personal, but you have to have enough trust with these people that they're going to try to understand where you're coming from. They're going to respect your artistic boundaries and at the same time kick your butt if you need it. You know, like, why do you have this whole section here? This doesn't mean anything. Or take out these prepositions, or no, you really need a preposition here, and all these different things. But you have to have a trust with that group. You have to be able to trust them with your work because it is personal. You do have to be able to say, no, I'm going to go with what I want to go. And you're going to have to know that they're not going to be so hard that they're going to say, why didn't you change that word that I told you to change? You know? Yeah.
Jim, you said you go to a number of different poetry groups, different poetry societies. Do you detect a difference in tone, in timbre?
I'm happiest in terms of the Arlington Six. I think it's the right size. I'm a member of several other poetry groups, and they tend to be more formal. I mean, the editing thing is in there and so on, and there is a degree of trust. But somehow this group seems to be the right size, and we're all comfortable with each other's work, and we give praise where it's due, and sometimes we get nastily nitpicky, and but that's okay too, because in John B. Lee's workshop yesterday, he talked about the absolute necessity of getting the preposition exactly right. So that one of the examples he gave was Anne of Green Gables and in Green Gables. They mean totally different things. Alice in Wonderland, Alice of Wonderland. Those things mean completely different things just because of the change of the in and the of. And so that kind of little picky stuff has to be done.
Is there a requirement for a good grammatical English structural language knowledge to be an effective poet?
I think so.
Yeah. Oh no, you were going to say. It's sort of like Warren Carreyrou said about writing free verse. I believe that's where I heard it. Might not have been his quote, but when you write free verse, people think that you're just not ignoring all the rules. But we are still paying attention to the rules, and we know the rules. we're consciously choosing to break the rules. It's not just that you string a whole bunch of phrases together and call it poetry. It's much more complex than that. And I think that's also where poetry gets a bad rap. People think free verse is just a bunch of sentences that you break.
Anybody could do it.
Anybody could do it. Yeah.
And I remember I took a poem to the group, and Elizabeth said something about the poem. I'd written something, and I used the word "and" repeatedly at the beginning of a line, and then the next line. And that's not normal to do in your writing. You normally say, well, if something's in apposition, take some of that out. Use commas, whatever. Use your breath. But this actually, Elizabeth said, yeah, this really works in the poem. So, it's that kind of sensitivity, too, that you want to be met with.
A deliberate technique to bring an idea across, a feeling across that you wouldn't get if you were following proper grammatical usage.
And I think one of the things that's kind of ironic is much of my harshest critic is my wife. And it took her a long time to get me to quit using the, if you like, pretentious word. All poetry is the use of simple words, yet exactly the right word. That you don't show off some incredible vocabulary just for the sake of showing it off. If the poem's going to be effective, yes, there'll be specific words in there, but they're not there to show off, to be pretentious, which is a temptation if you have an extensive vocabulary, right? Which apparently I do. So, but there's that fine line between the precision of using exactly the right word and not showing off with some fancy word that somebody's going to have to look up in a dictionary.
Before I pass the mic on to somebody else, I just want to say, one other thing. One of the things that we should be almost horrified of is when somebody points out, that's a great line. Well, that just means your poem's not balanced. If you've got a line that sticks out, they might as well have said, that's a great sore thumb. And so take it under advisement.
Okay. So in the different types of poetry, you write haiku. And, there's constraints in that. Does that help? Does that help deliver the ideas? Or?
Yeah, in a sense, it's an exercise that I can go back to over and over again. It's a pleasure to me being that precise. But I also write longer lyric poetry. I seem to have this weird, very long poem, a whole page long, or a short poem. So I can do a better long poem because I can cut. And when I was writing a play, about Adelaide Hunter Hoodless, and I had a friend who was my director, and he was helping me write it, and he kept saying, "Cut, cut, cut." So I gave him one word at the end, and then we started from there. That's an exercise worth thinking about.
In haiku poetry, there's not just the constraint of the structure of the poem, the 5-7-5 line structure and 11 syllables and whatnot. There's also the ideas that are being presented in the poem. I read someplace at one point, haiku has to involve some aspect of nature in it to be considered proper haiku.
Well, that's absolutely right. A traditional proper haiku is a nature poem. Senryu is a poem where the poet is having a little laugh at human nature. So they veer, and it's very, very hard to write a completely human-free poem. I mean, words creep in no matter what that suggest this is still close to a senryu. But if people are interested in the rules for haiku, which have changed incredibly.
The rules have changed?
Well, there are more of them now, because if you read Jane Reichold, you can go online and find this woman, Jane Reichold, who wrote 65 rules for haiku. And she said, pick 3. But so it's, go for the exercise, clean up your haiku by picking three rules you're going to use. It's definitely not, 17 syllables now. It's keep it short. Keep it so that you've got 2 lines that are together and 1 line that is separate. Don't write a list of 3 things. And basically, you can start anywhere. It's
Okay.
just
Are there still long form poems, the sagas, the ballads, the narratives, that go on for pages and take hours to read?
Yes. Yes, sometimes. Some poets do it. It doesn't, that's one that you have to sit down and read.
Mhm.
And it doesn't translate well. At the few times that we get to go read our poetry in public, someone who's got this long poem, unfortunately, I was at a reading like this, and the person just kept going on and on and on. And very long poetry doesn't translate well when you're reading it on a stage because people's butts get tired. And so you have to give them a break. You simply do have to give them a break. And people do still write whole books that are all on the same theme, although generally they're separate poems on the theme, but it's all on one theme, the death of their father or whatever. There are still longer poems, though. Yeah.
I think the longer poem is, dare I say, passé in the sense that they were originally written as sagas, as part of oral tradition, where the vast majority of people were illiterate, and the poems were read to them to inform them of the mythology of the particular culture of which they were a part.
So
I think they're dare I say, out the window these days.
So poetry then was more than just an art form. It was recorded history, orally recorded history.
Absolutely.
And because that's no longer necessary, we have YouTube.
Exactly. Yeah. Where there is no nuance.
Mark. Come on, the algorithms know what you want.
Oh, sure they do.
Mark?
I was just going to say that there's a lot of published poetry by good poetry houses that have some kind of trick in them, right? So it'd be some New York poet and they'll write, there's a poem published, I think last year, that's about, I think it's 300 pages long and it's a single sentence. Or there's some that will be, just a variation on a theme that just goes on and on and on for the entire book. I think they're almost unreadable. And whenever they're studied like online or in school, they're always divvied up anyway, right? They're going to study sections 5, 12, and 28, right? So it doesn't really hold together as a long poem anymore. I don't think anyone has that attention span.
Written more for the intellectual exercise of conforming to that particular artificial constraint.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Or somebody wrote an entire book of poetry, we're talking like 120 pages, let's say, and never used the word the. That's very difficult to do, right? Yes. Or never use a certain letter of the alphabet.
Right.
It's very difficult to do, but it's a constraint for the art.
Okay, so it develops the artist, doesn't necessarily do much for the public that reads it.
No.
Although I came across something by Margaret Atwood, and it turns out it's a play that could be staged on the London, Ontario stage beautifully. But basically, it was a poem. It's the Penelopiad. So she's taking the woman's point of view of the Odyssey. And she used that to write it's under 100-page poem, basically. And it can be done in the hands of a really, really good writer, I think.
Right.
And you don't notice it's a poem. I think that's the point. You don't notice it's a poem.
Doesn't that sort of defeat the purpose then? I mean, if you're writing poetry that isn't recognized as poetry.
Well, what she's done is, there's a lot of just subliminal energy in it because of how she's written it. And I think that she puts the message across and you get a kick out of it. It's funny, it's crazy, it's terrorizing, it's all kinds of things. There's the maids are hanging, reciting something themselves, they're hung, they've been hung. So, Margaret Atwood, I think, can do it. And she just keeps you riveted with this book, this poem, this play. And you hardly know what to call it. So it's
art.
Yeah.
It's art. Yeah.
Elizabeth, we haven't heard from you as a poet yet.
As a poet, yes. Well, okay. So I'm going to start off with, bring it down. Okay. I'm actually going to start with someone else's poem. Becky Alexander. She's a Cambridge poet who was in Tamarack. Is in Tamarack. She actually published my collection. But I want to share other people's stuff as well. And this poem is called Buried Deep. Details from a memoir by Sergeant Jim Alexander, M.M., Lincoln and Welland Regiment, Holland, 1945. In the kitchen, from the doorway to the hearth, lying on the floor like some colossal cigarette, a log, one end in the fire, burning slowly as flames surround a bubbling pot. It mystified the Canadian soldiers, those kept after the war, troops retained to rebuild a battered country, one that refused to be swallowed back into the sea. The explanation provided to the curious, because the Nazis took all of our metal, axes, pitchforks, scythes and hoes, even kitchen knives, a last-ditch effort to build more weapons. Allied saviors shared meals of boiled tulip bulbs, the most god-awful things you ever ate, along with Red Cross chocolate and ration tins of bully beef, bitter meals of freedom. Under our barn, wrapped in oiled burlap, we have our tractor and plow, buried bits cloistered away, following the final swoop of the red flag of the black on red. They never found them. Soon we will plant. And the next one is Becky's favorite poem of mine, and a lot of people like it actually, and it's happier. The Muffin Man. At 2.5, he's got it all figured out, how to find his TV shows and how to reach those muffins. He takes one glance over his shoulder as he stretches out his fingers. He's a bad boy, though. It's his third, but Mummy's talking on the phone, so she can't stop him. He fixes sad brown eyes on her to say, I need this chocolate chip muffin, to peel back the golden skin of enriched white flour and get to the center. Pick out each chocolate chip. Set it aside on the coffee table, filled with his sticky fingerprints and the goo of cooked muffin and chips mixed with his saliva. Place them there for later. Make a happy face with 8 chips curved in a smile, 3 for the eyes and nose. He's got his time alone with Mummy. His big brother and Daddy are off at scout camp together. At night, he sleeps on top of her, so she can't get away and leave him. Until he goes off to play school and sees his girlfriend Chelsea. He's decided his name is Sean. It sounds better. One day he'll fix those big brown eyes on another woman. She'll melt like those chocolate chips in his hot little fingers. That's the way it works. Not the least Oedipal. Just practicing on the first woman who loves him, picks up after him, feeds him. Actually, that was also picked for Cambridge Poem a Day, Cambridge Library. It's now called the ID Exchange. They had, for April, they had poems, a Poem a Day contest, and that one actually won a Poem a Day contest. So, yeah.
Lovely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there are outlets, public outlets for poetry, buses and libraries and
buses and library. I have one that was on the buses in Saskatoon by another Canadian poet, and I just got it. It's one of my favorites. He's a very, very nice man. And first time I saw him read this, it was in a bookstore like Chapters, only it's not Chapters, it's McNally Robinson, which is much better. And oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But Chapters isn't going to have my books anyway. And so he stood up and he goes, poem for reading in a bar. Hey, you in the back, come a little closer. The poem is warm, but its voice is soft. And you over there, I mean you, don't be afraid. The poem bites, but only the one it loves. And you, yeah, I mean you, looking so smug. Do you really think you're immune to poetry? This poem will get under your skin. You'll find yourself thinking about it tonight, as you're trying to fall asleep, your lips moving in the dark, alone in your bed with a poem you hardly know. When you wake, the bed will be empty, the sheet soiled, only the poem scent on your pillow to let you know it was there, only its footprints in the snow outside your heart. And that actually went on the Saskatoon buses for a while. Yeah.
Who was it?
Dave Margoshes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was just absolutely wonderful. He just stood there and he pointed at some poor guy because there was still the restaurant and the McNally Robinson thing. And I think some guy was just trying to get something to eat. And he pointed right at him and goes, "Hey, you. Yeah, you." You know? Which is a little off-putting, I think, if you didn't know you were going to be there for a book launch. It's from his collection, The Purity of Absence.
So there's as much acting involved in the delivery of that poem as there is the poetry.
I believe that we should do that when we're reciting our poetry. Nothing gets to me more. And I've been to a few readings where you get someone reading in a really soft voice, like this, and you're straining to hear them. And you know it's because they're saying, this is important. This is Canadian poetry. You have to listen to it. And my thought is, bring it out there to the people because it is a performance. People go to poetry readings, not just poets, but other people go to poetry readings. People drag along sometimes. They want to be entertained. They want to be brought into the experience. So if you're just reading it this light as a feather voice that people in the back can barely hear with no emotion, no inflection, that sort of deprives those people of the real poetry experience.
So the polar opposite of that seems to be slam poetry. I've been to one slam poetry reading. It was very exciting.
Yes. It can be very exciting. It's also very cutthroat.
Yes.
Very cutthroat.
Yes.
And I think I'm a little
loud. It was loud.
Yes. And it's so sad. The one time I took part in a slam, because I don't write slam poetry, but a bunch of us were invited, and even my own husband wouldn't vote for me. So that was just like, forget it. So no, because the announcer said, "Now you can't vote for anybody you know." So of course he listened to him and he said, "Okay, I can't vote for her."
Rules of poetry competitions.
Yes.
So you've mentioned competitions before. Who puts on poetry competitions and why?
Various people. The slam, it's a whole series of things that you build up to, like your provincial and your national. And there's a national Canadian poetry slam that Barb Day has been to. Others are put together by magazines or poetry societies to recognize people who deserve merit. And so recently, I'm not getting published for it, but I submitted to the Ontario Poetry Society chapbook competition, and I got an honorable mention. So it's a way to get people out there and have other people see what's happening. And for the journals, it's a way to sell their journal, because sometimes you get a free subscription with your entry.
Yeah, sometimes in graphic arts, we see these competitions where the companies are offering the competition simply to get some free samples of graphic arts, so that they don't have to pay the artist. Is that prevalent in the poetry sphere?
Sometimes you just get published, yes, just for the joy of being published. I had to buy Tamarack so I could get my poem. And there's another one, I don't know if it appeared online. Usually the minimum is that if you get published in a journal or something, you get published. If it's a poetry, like single poetry collection. But sometimes, and that's all you get. And sometimes you get money. But like I said, no poet is ever making a living at making poetry.
So there have to be day jobs.
Yeah, we all have our day jobs.
I was going to say a lot of magazines will do it. Elizabeth suggested. So you go in the contest, you pay $20 to put your entry in. And then there are winners, and the winners sometimes do get cash prizes. You get a yearly subscription to the magazine for having entered and paid your $20, which is the cost of subscription for the year anyway.
All right.
And some of those are good and some of them are terrible, but Rattle, I'm just going to hold that Rattle up. Rattle is a particularly good magazine. It's as good as poetry gets, modern poetry. And so they have a Rattle Prize once a year competition. It's a big deal.
Is that a Canadian publication?
No, it's American.
Okay.
But there's international poets that are win. They have top 10 poems of the year, that kind of thing. It's really a great magazine.
Okay.
So,
is there a selection you'd like to read from that? Or is there a selection you'd like to read?
Actually, I'm going to read a really short poem because it's my favorite poem, or at least I think it's the most wonderful poem.
Okay.
And it's an American poet, David Ferry, who did a lot of work as a translator of other people's poetry, but is a great poet in his own right. And it's only 3 lines. So again, this is what only poetry can do. In Eden, you lie in our bed as if an orchard were over us. You are what's fallen from those fatal boughs. Where will we go when they send us away from here? You can't say more than 3 lines, right?
That's very packed with imagery. Yes.
Yeah.
It's Genesis.
Well, yes, it's Adam and Eve and all of those things, right?
I kind of wrote a sister poem to that.
Oh.
So that's not nearly as profound. Prop the back door with the bell. Let the salt breeze pass through. The way you wade across our bed, a schooner tugs faintly on her line.
It's pretty nice.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, Mark is one of the few people that I absolutely adore listening to, because he can recite a poem in a soft voice, and every ear is standing at attention.
Well, when I said that, I meant the breathy
Yeah.
canlit voice
Yeah.
that you hear, Jack went up the hill. And you're sort of going, okay, well, but not Jack went up the hill. I don't want to pick on any particular writer, but it's, yeah. And then you try to look at them and they're pierced all over the place. You go, okay, I'm just going to have to look at my hands and hope that I can, listen to the poem nicely.
Yeah, so maybe I had the sort of reputation as the voice, but can I perhaps try and read one a little more softly that deserves to be read a little more softly?
I think you could do it fine.
Please do, Jim. Yes.
Okay. Anwin, which is the name of my older granddaughter. The beat of that tiny heart against an aging chest, wriggle of those frog legs cushioned on rounded belly, those many fingers curled on red faded golf shirt, the aroma of young life wafting into hairy nostrils, warm from that limpet seeping into senses. The tears roll gently down my smiling cheeks.
Your first granddaughter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely.
At a very young age.
Oh, yes. And you've pulled out something too, Lynn?
Oh.
Lynn's
Okay.
taking the mic.
Okay. Well, since we've let me go on and on about haiku, maybe I should read some, and if that's okay.
Sure.
I wrote 6 for solstice. I don't have to read all of them, but we'll start out. First time raised beds, tender lettuce, chard, chipmunk, and sparrow. Cirque du Soleil, these endless wire tents for the seedling peas. Brand new pistol grip econo watering thing. I water my shoes. The neighbor's Tom brings his invisible best act. Doubtful blue jay. What will I serve with my $64 vine ripened tomatoes? True story. Sister skunks stroll under my hammock. Lesson in prayer. There you go.
Good.
It's my kind of stuff.
Yeah. And all for the solstice, the summer solstice.
Yeah. And you're not supposed to have to tell anybody which season, but there should be a seasonal word in each. If it's a real haiku, there should be a seasonal word. It's called a kigo. And if you really get deep into the Japanese sensitivity, there's something that's called wabi, and that's a sense of like the hollowness of the voice, the hollowness of the word, and the hollowness of the world, which allows everything else to come to terms in it. So it's It's a special sound.
Does it work differently in Japanese? Is Japanese a denser language where they can squeeze more thoughts into fewer syllables?
Well, it's denser because they talk about onji. We got our 17-syllable idea from them, but they were using 17 sounds. The onji were sounds.
Oh.
And the word, I mean, they look at us, doing our level best to imitate them, and they listen to us use the word children. And they'd say, well, maybe that's a 5 or a 6-syllable word. So you shorten it up.
Because of the different sounds in the one word.
That's a very complex sounding word. We say it's 2 syllables, but they don't. They hear a lot more sound. Yeah.
And Mark, you were saying something about translating poems. How can that possibly work? I mean, if you've got something dense in Japanese, could you possibly translate something into English and still call it haiku?
Well, it'd be a challenge, wouldn't it? So, and I think it's a challenge for every language, because even not only are there not words in English for some things that are written in Slovenian or any other language, but it's hard to get the actual intent of the word, especially if it's cultural. So I think that's the brilliance of a good translator. Yeah. There's famous translators that will fall in love with one poet or even get to know that poet, and then they'll translate just that poet. And yeah, they'll spend as long translating that poem longer than the poet wrote, spent writing. Yeah.
I just can't imagine keeping all the elements of a poem intact. I mean,
yeah,
the structure of the poem, the rhythm, the intonation. I noticed that very few poems that you've read today are actually rhyming poems.
Right.
Lynn has something to say.
No, well, Jim can do that. I mean, he can rhyme.
I've got one rhyming.
Yeah.
One rhyme. But rhyming is sort of slightly out of fashion in the so-called literary poetry groups, because it tends to have this beat to it that is not necessarily pleasing. So that's why we generally don't do it. But here's mine. Worship in the boreal forest. Our vespers were whispers to the moon, and our matins sang the sun awake. We drank in the summer's long afternoons, began knitting blankets with the first snowflake. We fell in love to the dance of butterflies. Their white wings wove a spell of enchantment. Breezes touch on our needles were our lullabies, serenading our young to sleep's contentment. We were the high priests within our temple, celebrating rites to our God's abundance. Air, earth, water, light, our needs were simple. The 2-footed fiends stole away our innocence. There are no songs when each breath is an effort. All the brown needle branches are our scars. Dying, we entwine our roots for comfort, and sighing, send our sorrows to the stars.
I have one from very early on.
Can I just jump in just for a minute?
Absolutely.
If I could. I just want to say, when we were talking about when Lynn was talking about Margaret Atwood's play and how it was a poem, but didn't read like a poem, so people didn't recognize it. One of the beautiful things about a well-written poem with any kind of rhyme is that you shouldn't be able to see the rhyme, obviously. Otherwise, it's just sing-songy and it's childish, right?
Okay.
So Elizabeth's poem is fantastic that way. And in fact, it's so good that she actually has a inline rhyme right at the start as well. So our vespers were whispers to the moon.
Oh.
And so there's rhyming all over this poem, but you don't catch those rhymes, right? They're not so obvious that you see the rhyme.
I wouldn't have, except that Elizabeth made a point of reading it as a rhyming poem.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's what makes it a really good, like a quality poem. If the technique that you're using in the poem stands out, then the poem itself doesn't have much value, right?
Okay.
It's like seeing the lines when somebody's painted a wall. You don't want to see the lines, right? You want to see the wall.
Right.
So,
So following on to what Mark is saying, here's, given that criteria, a very bad poem, but it does rhyme.
I'm sure it's not, Jim.
Santiago. On his shoulder tilts a rod, pointing the path so often trod. In this town of Ford and Chevy, he strides determined to the levee. Dew-dappled Levi's faded cuff, along dusty curbsides scuff. Runners crunch the pearly gravel, keen to angle, migrants travel. Slimy pylons split the stream, hindrance to the caster's dream. Breezes push the sightless odor, sulfuric, past the tugboat's motor. Through Ambassador's massive arc stand unlit towers of the park. Oriole, Indian, Yankee teams thwart the tiger's pennant schemes. Today fish is his only care, minnows splash, striped bodies glare. The run is over, school is out, time to sell the pseudo trout. Scale-tained pockets, slimy dimes, magic simple, childhood times. Two scooper from the inverted cone, young Santiago trundles home.
That's another good thing about rhyming poems, that they're done well, is it can be humorous. They can talk about a humorous, I mean, because you wanted us to laugh there, did you not?
Sure.
Yeah. So it can make people laugh, and he still doesn't have what's called, disparagingly in the literary world, greeting card verse. And so if you're applying to different journals, they say no greeting card verse. And what they generally mean that they don't accept rhyming poems, but they definitely don't want anything that comes across like something that you would give your mother for Mother's Day.
Okay.
Although I think that would still be a great paying gig if you could learn how to write greeting cards.
Yeah, that must be poetry too. I mean, I have enough trouble writing a letter. You know, if I buy one of those greeting cards that's blank on the inside, I'm completely at a loss on what to put in there. So the folks that write the greeting card first are valuable to me, because I need something like that to enrich others' lives with the greeting cards.
Yeah, I mean, I have problems with that too. I have problems just signing birthday cards, or, you know, somebody's leaving the office cards and it's like, hope you have a nice life. No, that sounds like pushing you out the door. I think it's more, and it's unfortunate because you brought up a good point, that we should be more open to all forms of poetry, just as artists should be more open to certain other forms of artistry. Even the literature thing, genre writers, romance, science fiction, mystery, all of those kinds of things to write are extremely difficult. It looks easy. It looks very easy, but it's extremely difficult because there's a number of rules that you have to follow in each one of those genres. Fantasy as well is another one. The division between sci-fi, Star Trek, and science fiction. Science fiction is based on real science and extrapolating from based on real science, whereas sci-fi can get away with fudging stuff. It goes back to music nowadays, that we're all in these little pigeonholes that if you like 80s rock, okay, well, then you're an 80s rock kind of person. And if you like hip hop, well, then you're a hip hop kind of person. And if you like rhythm and blues, you know, and we all seem to be compartmentalizing ourselves, which I think is a negative thing as a community, as a society, to ghettoize each other away and put ourselves on these silos where we never learn anything new.
It really surprises me when I see an artist, a musician, who also paints. I mean, what are they doing out of their genre? You know, what are they doing out of the thing that I know them for?
Yeah. Well, some artists are lucky. They have multiple talents. I can see what I want to draw, but I can't draw.
No.
Not to save my life. So I'm very limited to writing. But there are other poets that I know who do watercolors and short stories or novels. One of the first times I met some of these people, there happened to be these, you told me later that they were agents in the crowd, and I read The Muffin Man, and they wanted to know if I wrote any literature because they were going to try to get me a book published. And I had to, no, just do poetry. Sorry.
Well, I have an example here. My scribbles. It's an example of the cover here. As you saw, that's one of the inks that my wife did, and that's the basis of design. And then on the back, there she is, and so on. But also, there's a section in this book of her poems. So she does both. I can't draw a straight line, but she can do watercolors, all of those things, inks, acrylics, and she writes great poetry.
Yeah. Oh, to be like that, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, in Waterdown, there's an art gallery called True North, and it's only paintings, I think, but it's all by musicians, Canadian musicians.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So,
Well, there's a specific.
very specific, yeah. But so many musicians do paint, though, right? Ronnie Wood's famous for his.
Yeah. And
Tom Wilson in Hamilton just started painting the last couple of years, had his first show.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. You have something else for us, Mark?
Can we handle one more sad one?
Oh, God, yeah, keep going.
Because we're moving, we've been going through all our crap, right? And
Treasures, please.
yeah. And last few days, especially last night, I've been thinking a lot about my dad. So it's a poem about my dad. And then peace. Like an old farmer putting in a fence post, that's how I'd like to die. Dad died at home, the cancer wild within him, short-circuiting everything that moved. He saw his workshop one last time. You and your brother, take whatever you want. Okay, Dad, okay. Late-night wheelchair strolls down the hall. Lullaby of blackbirds singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. Only a day or two of horror at the end. Only. We hold on to such measured blessings. You were only waiting for this moment to arrive. My brother was with him last. I don't often envy him that. Mom and my older sister gone to bed, worn out. Younger sister already back to California. I'd gone home, my stint done. I left knowing. Said goodbye, said, be at peace. I love you, Dad. Be at peace. Years slide by, posts go in, old farmers walk their fields, do the chores, work their land. Blackbird fly, blackbird fly. I should point out that I remember Elizabeth pointing out that there were 3 okays in a row at the end of the first stanza, and that one was too many. There was one too many, and so I had to remove one, and that was a great help. So just that little bit makes a poem a lot better.
Yeah. Did those okays get published, or did you excise them before they got committed to print?
I just checked. There's only 2.
There's only 2. You see 4, yeah.
So can I follow that one up about my mother as opposed to?
Yes, please do, Jim.
Okay. And this, incidentally, is the first poem I ever had published, which was in Tower Poetry 10 years ago or so. Ashes. Her gray ashes sit in a pressed board box on an attic shelf, next to light lace doilies with lavender scent. Below, a trunk's contents, sepia family photos known to her, stamps from a bygone era, sleeved in cracking plastic, crocheted samplers, musty address book, her favorite sherry glass. I'm happy that's the scene. There's no need for flashy urn to adorn the mantle. She is far from discarded, her memory embedded, a bond from womb to life's end, mother to son.
More silence. Appreciating the poem.
We do that sometimes with our work, is that somebody will read their piece and we'll all be sort of like, and then we'll ask them to read it again so that we can get a better sense of it before we make them take out an extra okay. But that is the joke in our group, is that generally we make poems smaller because we tell you, take this out, take this out, take this out, take this out. It's very rare that we tell someone to put something in. But yeah.
Does when you reread a poem, does it give you the same feeling as the first time that you hear it? I suppose it not as the first time, but people read poems over and over and over again. Are they trying to evoke the same feelings, the same emotions, or are they getting something new out of every time they read? When you read poems, what happens to you?
If I'm reading somebody else's poem, you mean?
Somebody else's poem,
yeah.
sure.
Actually, I get different things out of it. Absolutely. So I think like all great art, there's a third thing in created, right? There's the art itself. There's the person reading or looking at the art. And then there's what's going on in the person's life that makes that alive at the time. So there's something else being created at every moment. So when I read, there's a poem called Ithaca that I just love this poem. And I'll read it sometimes and it's about one thing. Sometimes it's about a different thing. And it's that's just great art. But it's always something more than what's on the page to me. And
so you're creating a new thing every time you reread the poem.
Yeah. Somehow it's being filtered through me, Yeah. I used to, went 4 years in a row. Was part of a boys' trip to New York, and we always went to MoMA, the art gallery. And so I would always revisit the same paintings that touched me the first time, and they always were different the next time I saw them. So, yeah, so great art's like that, and poems are the same way.
Yeah. How about you, Lynn? Do you reread poems?
Yeah, but give me another thought. I think that, to write a poem, you frequently have to, do something that's a bit messy, but you're trying to get out of the so-called left brain and into the right brain. And what's in the right brain is unpredictable. So if you reread a poem, and you're really in the right brain, if you agree to go there, it's an agreement. You can't predict what's in your brain. So you're going to get something that's there at that time. And it could be completely different from where you were the first time. So
then what is the expectation when you sit down to reread poems that you've enjoyed in the past? Do you expect to get something similar? Or do you expect something completely...
Of course, I expect to get exactly the same. The expectations, I loved it the first time, give me that again. It's like, wanting your favorite drink or your favorite craft dinner. I want it back. But, if you go into the agreement of, I just don't know, which is put quotation around that, you'll get something different probably.
That third thing that Mark was saying.
Which makes it alive and which makes it great. Yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left. Is there something else that you'd like to share?
Well, I would personally like to share a shout out to the Arlington, if that's allowed.
That seems entirely appropriate.
that they've been very kind to us, that they know who we are. We just call up for a reservation and they say, oh, the poets. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The poets. Yeah. We'll get you set up there. And we don't have to do anything. They serve wonderful dinners. I've eaten there. Good drinks. It's a boutique hotel in downtown Paris, Ontario. So I think you know what? They we used to meet in their bar. Now we meet in the lounge. But, it's just a wonderful place for us to get together. And they're very accepting of us as well, which not all places would be. That's why I think they deserve a shout out.
Well, I won't ask about your meeting times because we don't want the hordes of the public coming down to go watch the poets.
They've even saved the day.
The hordes, that's right.
But when we were in the bar, we were competing with their Trivial Pursuit night.
Oh.
So it made us better poets.
We went uptown to the restaurant.
Yes.
When there's competition for attention, for space, for audibility, does that interfere or does that enhance?
It interferes.
It interferes?
Yeah. We had 2 months ago, another meeting that Mark missed, we had this. Sorry, he's been busy, not to say anything.
Not a slacker, totally.
But, and there was a group sitting at what had been our usual table, and they were enjoying themselves. They weren't being particularly bad or anything. They were just enjoying themselves, as you would in a bar over dinner. And we couldn't really feel like we could start our poetry because we do need a certain amount of, I wouldn't say peace and quiet, but a certain amount of space in order to open up. And so we just talked about poetry and gossiped until they went away, and then they went away and we could start.
Yeah. So what's in your future? Do you have a ream of poetry that's ready to be published, just waiting for the publisher to show up at your doorstep? Yeah.
Elizabeth's nodding.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, well, this is out on YouTube or Twitter or whatever. I do with that in passing. That was the name of the chapbook that won an honorable mention. I sent it out to a publisher who rejected me last Monday. It's part of the life.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about sending it out to other chapbook publishers because I went through and did all that work, and I think it should be there. To get together a complete and whole collection is like about 80 poems at least. And so I'd like to get some of them out there. A chapbook is smaller. The chapbook is more like one of, I think I gave you my chapbooks. These chapbooks. This is by Catherine Gordon, a wonderful Guelph poet, and our Stan.
Very thin and stapled instead
Very
of,
thin and stapled.
blue-bound.
And it's a limited group of poems that you have there, but I'd like to get mine out there. So and put out for some other contests and things like that. So I'm full of ideas.
Okay. Jim, how about you?
I've got a whole study full of my writing, both poetry and prose, but I'm always overcome by essentially indolence. But sometime in the next year or so, I'm going to go ahead, either self-publish or send it out. I'm thinking that this time a collection of both my prose and my poetry, but don't hold your breath.
How about you, Mark? What's up for you?
I don't know. I've got about 20 poems that are decent, I think. And so it's a start to a book, but I'll see if it ever gets there. You know, it's, I was really very pleased to collect bunch of my, first poems into a book and have in one place, but you kind of put those to bed then. I don't know if I really have the urge to get another book out. So
would you go back to old poems and tweak them and update them and to republish them or to get them published in the first place?
No, I think I get kind of bored with them, Somebody famous, I can't remember who it was, said he's used publishing as editoring. Like he would do that. The same poem would appear in 6 books in different forms, and
for a classical reference, I think it's probably just best that they're left. One of the poets that I had to study when I was in high school was William Wordsworth, whose early stuff was absolutely brilliant. And his dotage, he went back and ruined it all.
Yeah. There are some poems, though, you just know they should be better than they are, I was going to say the poem that really got me interested in poetry was Lake of Innisfree by Yeats. And Yeats. And it starts, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. It's a beautiful rhyme, like beautiful rhythmed line. And the poem itself is a great poem, but it does not hold up to that first line, And I always think that poem could have been better, than it was, even though it's known as a great poem. So, sure.
Lynn, what are you going to be doing next?
Well, I'm probably going to go through some cartons that I have in a room that I would like to own again. I used to be, at one time I was a newspaper editor, and so I've always written, and I always kept hard copy, whether it was handwritten or printed, and I would throw it in. I've got filing cabinets, I've got cartons, and I think a lot of it has to go because really, I think like Mark said, you go back to some stuff and it's just not worth trying to salvage. So I would like to put out something for my grandchildren. Not that they will appreciate it now, but I would like to put something together and just have it for them.
I was going to say, I think you should. A trunk full of paper is just a trunk full of paper, but a book is something that somebody will put on their shelf. It's held, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Are any of the Arlington Six online? Can I provide a link in the show notes so that we can read more poetry, possibly to your Amazon page? Or
we are not.
I would be.
We are old school.
I would be very happy to publish the poetry you've read today on the webpage. So if that's amenable to you, then you can do that.
That'd be wonderful.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
You send me the poems, the words, and I publish them. It's not like I'm a publisher. I'm just putting stuff on the internet
It's an anthology
of today.
of the Arlington Six,
Okay.
with
Very good.
Jim named today. Just so you know.
Although maybe that's the big plan, because Linda was saying that in one of the breaks that maybe we should put together an anthology of our poetry, even if it's a short one.
This would be a start.
This would be a
Okay.
start. It would be a wonderful start. And I wish Kathy and Stan could be here today. We would have filled the whole studio, but it would have been a wonderful time.
Yeah. It has been a wonderful time. Thank you very much to Elizabeth, Mark, Lynn, and Jim, the Arlington 4 of the 6. This has been CKMS Community Connections on CKMS FM 102.7 Radio Waterloo. My name is Bob Jonkman. We'll be back next week, Monday at 10 o'clock with more CKMS Community Connections.